Have a seat. I'm glad you like each other. That's a good thing. So I want to start today with a quote by Eric Hoffer. And Eric Hoffer, I hate to call him a philosopher because that means he doesn't do much else, but that's what he is. So this is a quote that I found interesting. He says, "Fear of the future causes us to lean against and cling to the present, while faith in the future renders us receptive to change." And the idea that he's talking about that is he says that our basic attitude and disposition towards what gets to come radically and dramatically affects how we feel about it. So if you view the days ahead, the next day is going to be worse than today, and the day after that is going to be worse than tomorrow, if that makes sense, that the future continuously gets scarier, that it continuously gets worse, what it's going to cause, it's going to cause you to kind of dig in your heels and just focus on what's now and do whatever you can to preserve what's now. But if, on the other hand, if your feeling is like, you know what, there are better days to come, there are things, exciting things that are happening, new things that are coming up, then what's going to happen is you're naturally going to want to enter into that. You're naturally going to be able to shape that, and you also will be shaped by that. That our basic attitude and thoughts on the future change how we affect it. And so that was kind of our hope throughout the series, is that we could start a conversation on the future, and we could start a conversation about what is yet to come. And that as a result of that, we would be the kind of people who would begin shaping the future, that we would begin shaping the days ahead. Because I feel like the church historically has been known that we're just digging our heels into the past, and anything that comes up that's new, that's innovative, we just kind of rail against and kind of bemoan if we could just go back to the days of old. And I don't believe that's what our posture should be. I believe that as followers of Christ, our posture should be that we are the ones who are having a consistent conversation about what God is doing, what we expect God to do, and how we need to enter into that, and how we can shape that and be a part of it. So throughout this series, we've tracked with the nation of Israel, the people of God, and in particularly a guy by the name of Joshua. And we looked at a couple different things. We've looked at how when we know the history, when we know the stories of what God's already done, it should propel us into the future. And for many of us, what happens is that when we've seen significant things in our past, we just kind of want to retreat to it, and we just want to stay there. But as we know how God has acted throughout history, it should cause us to be more excited about the days ahead, because we are going to assume that He is going to continue to act. And we also, we looked at last week that our faith should cause us to fear missing opportunities more than failure. That for most of us, that's kind of a foreign concept, because we've got this idea that our name gets attached to failure. So all we need to do is play it safe, and then our reputation isn't risked. But when we understand how God is directing us, that'll cause us to not want to miss out on what God is doing, and to desperately want to be a part of what's happening. And so that's what we've looked at so far. And this is what I want to do today as we wrap up this series then in the third week, is I want to talk about how do we actually enter the future? Like, how do we actually step into what we believe God is calling us to do? And so everything up to now, it's kind of been about changing our thoughts and changing our perspective and changing our focus. And today I want to look at, like, for the moment when, like, opportunities come before you or things come up that are brand new, how do you actually step into it? How do you work into that? And as I've talked to people, I've noticed that there's two main ways that most of us engage the future. And the spiritual way that people refer to is, I'll hear people talk about prepping. Now, I imagine most of you have probably seen some semblance of the show that's about people who prep for the end of times and the end of the world and things like that. And so you get to watch those crazy people and all the, like, I was going to say canning, as if canning's crazy. I don't mean that canning's crazy, but like walls and walls of canning. That may be a little crazy. And just like this sense that, like, Armageddon, doomsday is coming, and so we have to be prepared for it. And the interesting thing, like, if you're, like, just physically going to do that, if that's your thing, that's perfectly fine. Knock yourself out. Have at it. What concerns me and what confuses me is when people think that prepping for Armageddon or the end of the world is the spiritual response to the future. Like, our faith leads us to prep for doomsday, and so we need to, like, fill our basement with, like, gallons and gallons of water and hundreds of pounds of food, and we need to like build a bunker, and we need to do all these different things. I'm not saying against anything like, sure, have food in your basement. It keeps you from having to walk upstairs when you're hungry. It's a great thing. Have a bunker. Bunkers are cool. I'm with that. But what's weird to me is when people say, like, assume that it's the spiritual thing to do is to prep for the end of the world. And let me explain it like this. And for some of you, this is going to be concepts that are a little weird that we don't talk about much. But this is how I understand it. So if we look at Bible prophecy, like Book of Revelation stuff that talks about the end of time, this is what it says. And I believe this is like 95% of scholars would agree that this is the most accurate reading. That there will be a day that the Antichrist comes and is in power of the entire world. I know some of you are like, wait, what's happening? You need to read Revelation. I'm not going to get into everything. So the Antichrist is going to come and be in power in the world. And then the world is basically going to go to hell from there. And I don't mean that as an adjective. I used it in the proper sense of the term, so no one can be mad at me afterwards, okay? So, like, that's going to happen. Before that happens, and again, 95% of the scholars agree with this, that Jesus is going to take all the Christians to heaven with him. And we refer to this as the rapture. And so, like, Jesus is going to take all the Christians to heaven with him, and then because all that good is gone from the world, it'll pave the way for the Antichrist to come, and then the world goes to H-E-double hockey stick from there, okay? And so that's how we view, as some of you need to spell that out, hockey sticks is an L, just so you know. And so that's kind of how we, like, and so when that happens, when the Antichrist comes, we view that as like Armageddon, that's doomsday, that's when everything goes bad. Now this is what confuses me. It's Christians who say, we need to prep for Armageddon. I go, but the rapture comes before that, when all the Christians go to heaven. So by prepping for the Armageddon, which camp do you think you're in? Like, you think you're sticking around with everybody else? You think that's like, so your super spiritual response is to assume that you're missing out on everything and you'll get it on the second time around? Like, do you understand like how crazy that is? To go like, yeah, I'm prepping for Armageddon because rapture comes, I don't think I'm going to make the cut. But I trust in Jesus enough that it's going to happen, and I'll catch him second time around. We'll do that. And so, like, I hear Christians talk about this, and, like, again, like, if you're just a prepper, if that's your thing, have at it. Like, go for it. But don't assume that that is, like, the most spiritual thing you can do is to prep for the end of the world. So that's one way that I see people enter the future, and we hear that, and we go, some of us are like, whoa, that's crazy. And so the second way that we opt to enter into the future is planning. And hear me very clearly when I say this. I am not against planning at all. And I've heard people who were spiritual leaders say, like, you shouldn't plan because you should trust in God. And I think that's crazy. Like, I think we should trust in God, and I think we should plan. Like, I know what I'm doing just about every hour of every day. Not because I'm a planner, because my wife tells me, and so that works. Just kidding. She's not in here. I'm safe. Don't tell her. This is between us. So, but like I'm a planner. I think that's important. It helps me. I also, however, believe that all my plans should be written in pencil, and when God changes those plans, I should be ready to kind of tear up the paper and throw it out. Okay, so I think that's important there. But for lots of us, we just say, okay, because we can't do that, then the way that we enter the future is we need to have a really, really thorough plan that tells us what to do. But there's two problems with that I see. The first one is this, is that our plans, while I think we should have plans, don't do a great job of accounting for God. They don't. Because you can't really like go through the plan and be like, well, I'm going to do this, and then I'm going to do that, and then I'm going to do that, and then God is going to show up right here. It's like, no, it doesn't work like that. I think we should have plans, and when God shows up, we should be willing to change them. So that's a hard part, is plans don't always account for God well. The other hard part about planning is that you still have to have courage to step into it. Like, you could have the best plan in the world, but you still are going to face that moment of testing where your courage is on the line and knowing, can I actually enter into this? And I think having the greatest plan in the world doesn't change that moment when we have to step into it. And so this is what I found, is that most of our conversations and most of our ideas are really, they're anemic when it comes to actually stepping into that future, when the opportunity is laid directly before us, and all we have to do is have courage and boldness to enter into it. So that's what I want to look at today. I want to look at when that moment comes, how do you enter into the future that your faith envisions? And so if you have a copy of the Bible with you, we're going to continue our work in the book of Joshua. Today we're going to be in Joshua chapter 6, and this is what has happened up until this point in time. And this is like, I can't do this proper justice because this is like, there's so much tension in this moment. So what has happened is God has promised the nation of Israel that he will give them a land. And this is huge because your land was tied to your identity. So if you had no land, people viewed that you had no identity. And so he has promised them that he will give them the promised land, this like incredible land, and that he will make them a nation. And so he promised this to them for over 400 years ago when they were still in slavery. And so when they're in slavery, he has promised them that they would go into this land. And so they go through hundreds of years in slavery, and then they're led out of slavery. And then they have these incredible moments where God parts the Red Sea, and they walk through on dry ground to evade the Egyptian army. And then they're in the desert for 40 years. God sends food from heaven to feed them. Like there was no food in the entire area because it's a desert. And so God sends food directly from heaven. And then leadership transitions from Moses, who was back here in Egypt, to Joshua. And now Joshua's in charge. And he leads them across the Jordan River on dry ground. God stops the water from flowing. And then they're at this point in time where they are outside the walls of Jericho, which is the land that had been promised to them. And it's kind of this moment, like over 400 years of buildup. And all of a sudden, they're right there. And so the question kind of is like, okay, we're here. What happens now? Because the city of Jericho had these huge walls that were built around it. And so it's like, okay, so what do we do now? How do we actually get into the promised land? And that's the story we're going to look at. So this is Joshua 6, starting in verse 2. And this is God speaking to Joshua. It says, "Then the Lord said to Joshua, 'See, I have delivered Jericho into your hands, along with its king and its fighting men. March around the city once with all the armed men. Do this for 6 days. Have 7 trumpets of ram's horns in front of the ark. On the 7th day, march around the city 7 times with the priests blowing the trumpets. When you hear them, sound a long blast on the trumpets. Have the whole army give a loud shout. Then the wall of the city will collapse and the army will go up, everyone straight in.'" And this is what I would have done. Could I have a different plan? God, could we do something else? Like, think of this. Okay, so ready. Like, put yourself legitimately in Joshua's shoes. Like, you're the leader of the nation. The walls are there. And you got to go up in front of the people, and people go, okay, what are we going to do? How's this going to happen? All right, guys, listen, here's the deal. We're gonna walk around the city, but that's just the first day. And people are like, oh, okay, good. That's just the first day, because we're gonna get like a bulldozer in here. We're doing something else, like we're gonna like bang on the walls. Everybody get their shovels, something like that. I'm ready. Okay, that's just the first day. Then we're gonna do it. We're gonna do it for 6 days. We're gonna walk around the wall. Okay. Then, okay, good. He's got something else. Then on the 7th day, we're gonna walk around 7 times. Is this it? No. And then, okay, good. There's something else. And then we're gonna yell. And then what? That's it. Walk around, go home, walk around, go home, do that 6 times, walk around 7 times, yell. Let's hope. Like, seriously, like, if that's you, how crazy would you feel? Like, how absolutely insane would you feel in that moment? Giving, like, this is your grand orders to all these people. This is what we're going to do. Okay. And so they do. And so for 6 days, they march around the wall. And think if you're the people in Jericho, think how crazy this looks. Like, you're up there standing guard on this wall. This nation of people with no home comes in right before you, and they start marching around your wall. You're like, okay, here comes the battle. They're coming from the front. Wait, hang on, they're on our left side. Everybody's on the left side. Wait, they're behind us. All right, everybody, the right side. Oh, they went home. What? So they do that. 6 days they march around. And then this is the seventh day. This is picking it up in verse 15. It says, on the seventh day, they got up at daybreak and marched around the city 7 times in the same manner. Except on that day, they circled the city 7 times. The 7th time around, when the priest sounded the trumpet blast, Joshua commanded the army, shout, for the Lord is giving you the city. The city and all that is in it are to be devoted to the Lord. Only Rahab the prostitute and all who are with her in her house shall be spared, because she hid the spies we sent. That's another story. We'll talk about that another time. But keep away from the devoted things so that you will not bring about your own destruction by taking any of them. That's really important. He gives this note. He says, like, hey, in here, they've got things that are devoted to other gods that they've made up. And they're nice, and they're idols, and they're shiny, and they're pretty, and you're going to want them. Don't take them, okay? So again, don't take the shiny things, is what he says. So that you will not bring about your own destruction by taking any of them. Otherwise, you will make the camp of Israel liable to destruction and bring trouble on it. All the silver and gold and the articles of bronze and iron are sacred to the Lord and must go into his treasury. Verse 20. When the trumpet sounded, the army shouted, and at the sound of the trumpet, when the men gave a loud shout, the wall collapsed. So everyone charged straight in, and they took the city. This is what amazes me about the Bible, is it's not written like a novel. Like, it's not like a screenplay or anything like that. It doesn't have like all this build up to the moment, and then you're just like, oh, what's going to happen? We went to see the new Hunger Games movie last night. So I'm not no spoilers, no people are nervous, stuff like that. And there's like this one scene, which is like it's kind of a scary scene. I wasn't scared. I didn't get scared like that. Don't laugh. So there's one scene that's kind of a scary scene, and it's got like I almost wish movies didn't have soundtracks, because like they're walking through a tunnel and it's like it's like, oh, this is going to turn out well. I can tell that. This is when things get good. And it's just like stretching on minute after minute, and so you're like, and like nothing's happening. Like 10 minutes go by and you're like, somebody's going to die. I know. Are they all going to die? Is it just one person's going to die? And it's like, because that's how stories are told, fake stories. This one, like over 400 years of buildup. One verse. When the trumpet sounded, the army shouted, and at the sound of the trumpet, when the men gave a loud shout, the wall collapsed. So everyone charged straight in and they took the city. Like, that's it. 450 years of buildup. One verse. That's all we get. And so I think it's incredible. So the wall collapsed. And the people entered the promised land. And so they have this nation that's their own that they can thrive in. And here's what I think this is the important question that we need to ask about it is who gets credit for the miracle? And we know this because we're in church. God. God gets credit. Of course he gets credit, which I agree with entirely. Like, God gets the credit for the miracle. We don't believe that somehow in their marching around that they kind of shook the foundations of the ground and threw that off, and then somehow when they yelled, the acoustic waves reverberated within the walls and caused it to crumble. We don't believe that. The marching didn't cause the walls to fall. The yelling didn't cause the walls to fall. God caused the walls to fall. But it is important to note that God does ask them to march and to shout. That for them was their faith. Now, it didn't cause the walls to fall, but I believe this wholeheartedly. If they had not done that, the walls would still be standing. Because although it sounds crazy, and although it's really weird that they fight their battles by marching around a wall and yelling, that was their part of it. 99%, almost all the credit goes to God. But they still had to do their part in terms of stepping into the future. And so that's what I want to talk about today, because I see it like this. When it came to the Israelites entering the future, God's orders to them was to take a step of faith and to give a shout of praise. That yes, he caused the walls to fall, but when it actually came to that moment that was over 400 years building up to it, when it came to that moment, the instructions he gave them was to take a step of faith and to give a shout of praise. And that's what I want to talk about today. First, a step of faith. I think the big distinction between a step of faith and planning is steps of faith are not able to answer the what if. Kind of the like, what if this happens? Or what if this doesn't take place? When we set out our elaborate plans, which we do, we've got to like plan A, plan B, plan C. If this doesn't work, if this doesn't pan out, then I'm going to just kind of go down the line and we've got those other things. Steps of faith don't have that. And so as part of a step of faith is this incredibly inherent risk to them. And I think we need to acknowledge that because while if it is a God-directed step of faith, it's a sure thing. Like it is. If it's a God-directed step of faith, it's a sure thing. We're going to feel on our part some risk to it because we can't answer what happens if God doesn't show up. Like, so if we look at this story, what happens if God doesn't show up? Like, what happens if on the seventh day they march around 7 times, they yell, and then that's it? Like, what do you do if you're Joshua? It's like, scream at the top of your lungs, do that, and then it's like, okay, let's go back to Egypt. Like, what do you do in those moments when, and I think those are the questions that go throughout our head. I look at this as I kind of go throughout Scripture, and I read it, and I read these like incredible steps of faith that people took, and I think like, what if that doesn't happen? Like, what if it doesn't turn out? How humiliating would that be? Like, one of the most famous stories in the Bible, Jesus feeding the 5,000. The story goes like this. The disciples come up to Jesus. He's got all these thousands of people around him who he's been teaching. They go, we should send these people away. They're hungry. They haven't had anything to eat. And Jesus goes, you give them food. And so they bring in this little boy. And they go, this is all the food we have. He has 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish. And it says Jesus takes it. He prays over it. And he begins passing it out. And it feeds over 5,000 people. And they had basketfuls afterwards. What if that doesn't happen? What if the disciples take the little boy's bread and fish and they pass it out and it only gets to the first 6 people? And then they've got to look at the little boy like, hey, buddy, sorry Jesus stole your lunch. But like, honestly, how humiliating would that be? This is a weird story in the Bible. There's a story of this little boy who passes away. So he's dead and God's prophet comes in and he stretches himself out over the boy and starts blowing air into his mouth. And I read that and I think in my head, like, that's cool, but no way. Like, that's crazy. Like, it seems crazy. What happens if he stretches himself out on the boy who's dead and he doesn't come back to life? Like, how embarrassing is that? Like, that's an awkward moment. Like, well, that didn't work. Sorry about your loss. And walk away. And this is important because I think we face this continuously. That when we have steps of faith that are before us, we may see what God is leading us into, but the thing that is replaying in our head over and over again is the risk that we are taking. And that's important to acknowledge, that every step of faith has some risk to it because we can't answer the what if God doesn't show up. But the important thing within that is that we have to acknowledge that it must be a God-directed step of faith. That when he is leading you into something, when he is leading us into something, that it's not a question of what if. He's going to be there. It's a sure thing. We may play the scenarios throughout our head, but he has already promised that that's what will happen. And I know the difficult part of that, and we could spend forever talking about this, of how do you know if it's a God-directed step of faith or if you're just making it up on your own. And this is what I found. Let me just speak to this personally. Is for me, taking those steps of faith have been when everything in my head and everything in my life seems to say, stay, and something deep within me says it's time to go, then I know that's God speaking. And also the reverse of that is when everything in my head and everything logical seems to say it's time to go, and God says stay, I know that's God speaking. An example that I'm sure I've said before, so you've probably heard this, is before we planned the church, when I was a youth pastor, we had an offer to go to a church that was a church of 1,000. That was a much bigger church. It would have been a great career move if that was my focus. So we went up there, we interviewed with the church, we met the youth group, we loved the kids, we loved the adults there. I saw the budget for the youth group and personally, and it was nice, and so that didn't hurt. And so like we're looking at all these different, they called us up for a second interview, and we did all this different stuff, and my wife said, let's go look at houses, so we picked out a house, and like everything was in line. And the pastor told me, he said, hey, after service Sunday morning, because we stayed for the Sunday morning service, after service, I'm going to call you into my office, I'm going to ask you if it's a yes or no. I was like, okay, sounds good. So we went through the whole service, and then he called me into his office, and he said, okay, so do you want the job? And I went, no. And then I went, what? And he's like, are you sure? I was like, yeah. I don't know why, but I'm sure. And then I didn't even get a chance to talk to my wife, Bethany, about this. And so like I went out and I got in the car and we started driving home, and she goes, well, what'd you tell him? I told him no. And she went, what? I was like, yeah, I know. And then she began to pepper me with questions over the next 15 minutes. So like, you know this is dumb, right? Well, I know it's dumb. Like, thank you. And it's crazy looking back on that, because in the second, the decision didn't make any sense. It didn't, but I knew it was right, but it didn't make any sense. And but if I would have made that decision, we wouldn't get to do this. And I think that's important to acknowledge, that as we go through steps of faith, everything outside may say, do this, when something within your heart says don't. And everything outside may say don't, and something within your heart says do this. And that's God directing us. And so we need to acknowledge that stepping into the future has risk. But when God orders those steps, it's a sure thing. And so for us as a church, there's lots of things in the weeks and years ahead. There's additional sites that we're looking at to be closer to people who need to know God. There's an online campus that we've been working hard at developing that we're hoping will come sooner than later, in order to reach people who wouldn't come here on a normal Sunday morning. But for us right now, the next step is to go to 3 services to create space for people in our community. And just to be clear, we're not a Field of Dreams church. We're not if you build it, they will come. Like, we're going to go get them, and that's what's going to happen. But I think that's the first thing that God calls us into when stepping into the future, is that we would take a step of faith. The second thing is this, is a shout of praise, that we would give a shout of praise. And here's what I found over the years when it comes to a shout of praise, is that I think I was taught incorrectly about what a shout of praise was. And if I could explain it like this, like when they shout, it's not just yelling for the walls to fall. Like historically, we understand that is a shout of praise. That's what they're doing in that moment, is they're giving a shout of praise. And for us here, likewise, we have Sunday mornings here, we have music. The host, whoever comes up, we've had a video for the series, they'll refer to it as, and we're going to have some music this morning that you can sing along. And the reason why we refer to it as music is if you're coming here today, if you're here this morning, and you're not a follower of Christ, you don't know where you are on this spectrum, that's all it is. It's music. It's nice. But if you are a Christian, if you do consider yourself a follower of Christ, it becomes something so much more than music. It becomes worship. It becomes praise. And I think that distinction is significant. So this is how I was taught. I was taught that worship is, and one of the key statements that stuck with me was, worship indoctrinates us. And so what that means is worship takes beliefs that we hold in our head, and through the singing and through the music, it makes its way into our soul. It makes its way into who we are. And so that's why we sing these things, is it's a reminder of the beliefs that we have, and it makes it part of who we are, which I agree with. But there was part of me that didn't like it, because I simply saw worship as conformity. And it's conformity to God, but I almost felt like worship just makes me like a robot. Does that make sense? It's like, okay, I've just got to say the statements, I got to do the things, doesn't matter if I believe it or not, doesn't matter if I care, this is what we do, because I say these things over and over again, and so I'll be a good Christian, and I'll sing when I'm supposed to, so I can be a robot for Jesus. And I don't think that's what it is. while it is those things, it's something far more significant. And let me explain it like this. This is how we understand Scripture, and this is how we understand our world. That the Christians are called to serve as a counterculture from the world that we live in. That we are called to be in the minority. Now, I don't believe at any span in time have the followers of Christ been a majority in an area. Well, I assume we're a majority here. Okay, I'll take that. But in terms of nations, in terms of political structures, I don't think at any point in our history, and I know polls would say different because people claim to be Christians, but I wholeheartedly believe, I don't believe Christians have ever been a majority anywhere. And the reason why we fail to see this distinction is we've misunderstood the difference between having Christian values and morals and actually following Christ. And so what's happened is, let's say our nation, for example, our nation was founded on Judeo-Christian values and morals. I didn't say we're a Christian nation, okay? I said that if you look at our statements of belief and our statements, not of belief, because that's not what we have, our statements of who we'll be as a nation, they are founded on Judeo-Christian values and morals. But that is vastly different from believing that Jesus Christ died for my sins because I am a sinner, and my response is to accept his forgiveness and spend the rest of my life following him. You see that these are vastly different things. To hold Christian values and morals, you can do that and not follow Christ. This is why so many people think they're Christians. They go, oh yeah, I'm a Christian because I have political stances that lead me to believe that I agree with Jesus Christ. That's not following Jesus with your life. That's different. And so as a result of this, what I believe is that Christians were called to serve as the counterculture, continually calling people back that this is the God we serve, to actually show them a different way of life and a different way of living and relating to one another and caring for one another. To understand that there is a world that can be held up by grace and mercy and love and forgiveness and truth. That these are more important values than our stances on whatever political issues we may have. That this is the more significant thing. If we could put it in actual scriptural terms, what it says is this, is that there is a kingdom of heaven that God is one day going to establish fully. But what's happening right now is it's rising up among us in bits and pieces. And what we do is we see it in the compassion that one person extends to another, and the forgiveness that one person extends to another, and the way in which we live our lives on an everyday basis is an evidence that there is a kingdom that is not fully established yet, but we see glimpses of it in pieces. That this is the kingdom that we're a part of. And so what we're doing within worship is we are actually making a statement, not just of our conformity to God, but our defiance of the world that we live in, the values that they say that we must hold. And I think that is so significant that if you are in culture for long enough, you are going to be impacted and influenced by it. And so what we do through the music that we sing and through the lyrics that we voice and we proclaim and we shout and we sing is we're actually making a statement that I am a part of the kingdom that is here but not quite yet. Let me show you some examples of this. To be conformed to the world is to make this statement, I matter most. This is one of the most centrally held values in the entire world. I matter most. I am the most important thing. But we sing these lyrics instead. You are holy. You are great. You are mighty. This is vastly different. And we need to be constantly reminded of it, that our lives are not about us. In a similar way, to be conformed to the world is to say this, you only live once. I was going to say YOLO, but I felt silly doing that. But that's what it is. Like, make whatever decisions you want to make. Seize the opportunity because you only live once. The act of defiance says this, let heaven come. That, yeah, I may only live once, but I live forever. And so let that other kingdom come that I want to be a part of. To be conformed to the world is to say, the primary belief is that we need to fear the future because we don't know what's coming. And this is the predominant idea that people have, that I'm scared of the days ahead. But our statement is different. We sing, "Let hope rise." The power of that statement is so significant. Let hope rise. Because we do not need to be afraid of tomorrow, because the God who was with us in the past will surely be with us in the future. So let hope rise. And this is what I found personally, is that when we begin to understand that, when we begin to understand that worship is not just conformity, but it is an act of defiance to the world that we live in, then worship becomes the energy with which we live our lives. For me, when I have purposefully taken steps of faith, and when I feel I have been thrust into situations where faith was absolutely required of me, worship is the only thing I held on to. Because from that, I drew all the strength that I had. Because there have been times in my life that I had needed to be incredibly reminded that the kingdom that I live in is not the one that has been fully established yet. It is one that God is rising up among us and will fully establish someday. And so it became the energy with which I lived my life. Now, this is what I found. And I hear people like, if your worship has grown stale, if it's nothing to you, if it's boring, then you're probably not living by faith. I'm not saying you don't have faith, okay? I'm not saying you don't have faith. But I'm saying maybe there's some steps you need to take, or maybe there's some opportunities that have passed by already. Because when we're actually taking steps of faith, then all our energy is drawn from our shouts of praise. And so I believe that this is how God has us step into the future. A step of faith and a shout of praise. This is the way in which we're called to engage that next step. That we would understand that how we see things is different, but when it actually comes up, when the opportunity is before us, we wouldn't prep, because that's crazy. We wouldn't plan, because there's some factors that's missing. But that we would do it with a step of faith and a shout of praise. Let me show you how the story ends. So this is the last part that we read. It says, when the trumpet sounded, the army shouted. And at the sound of the trumpet, when the men gave a loud shout, the wall collapsed. So everyone charged straight in, and they took the city. And they all lived happily ever after. No, that's not how it ends, of course. This is what happens. So they charge in. Joshua tells them right beforehand. He goes, hey, don't commit yourself to the devoted things. Get rid of those, the things that worship other gods. And they kind of went in. They go, ooh, look, it's shiny. I'm going to take that. Gives this word to Joshua. He says, they've committed themselves already, like we're a day in, to things other than me. And he makes this statement. This is Joshua 7:13. This is God speaking. He says, go, consecrate the people. Tell them, consecrate yourselves in preparation for tomorrow, for this is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says. There are devoted things among you, Israel. You cannot stand against your enemies until you remove them. The word consecrate, if you remember, that's the first word that we looked at in this whole series. The first call that Joshua gives to his people is he says, consecrate yourself. Consecrate means to devote yourself to a higher purpose. And so I think within this, we find the rhythm with which we engage the future. Let me show you. First, that we would devote ourselves to a higher purpose. That we would understand that what we have in terms of our resources, our relationships, and everything that is laid before us is not ours to own, that we are stewards of it. That our lives are not lived simply for ourselves, but we are devoted to something higher. This is what it means to consecrate yourself, to devote ourselves to a higher purpose. Then we would begin to see that we are responsible for the opportunities God's given us. We do not need to fear failure. We need to fear missing out on what God has put before us because we were too scared to take that step. Once we begin to understand that we're responsible for the opportunities, we would use the past to propel us into the future. That we would take the stories of old throughout history, throughout the pages of Scripture, throughout other people's lives, throughout our own lives, to give us the courage we need to take that next step. To understand that if God has worked before, surely he is not done working. And we should even believe that his greatest works are yet to come, that he has built up momentum throughout history. And so the best days are before us. And once we use the past to propel us into the future, when it actually came time, we would do it with a step of faith and a shout of praise. That we would take those God-directed steps of faith and we would draw our energy from our praise to God and our defiance of the world. And that we wouldn't end there, but that when that happened, we would devote ourselves to a higher purpose. This is the rhythm that God establishes that we engage the future. To devote yourself, to be responsible for opportunities, to use your past to propel you into the future, to take a step of faith with a shout of praise, and to devote yourself all over again. Let me say this. I believe with everything that is within me that your future, I want to talk about our future, but I will talk more specifically that your future, that God has something that he is seeking to do. I believe that wholeheartedly. This is what I found. And don't take this as an excuse that I'm giving myself, okay? Because I'm not. I'm praying. I'm going to do whatever God lays before me. But this is what I found, is that the people who God uses most are rarely the people who stand on a stage. Okay? The people who God most radically works in to shape the story that we all live in are rarely the people who have a microphone and stand on a stage. That is instead through often unlikely, unexpected people that God rises up to radically shift the story of history and to call people to him. And so I don't want you to hear this as this is my rhythm. I want you to understand this is your rhythm. This is the call that God has laid before us in terms of how we step into the days that are yet to come. And my encouragement to you is to do that courageously, to do that boldly, because I know we have a lot of work before us, and I believe our best days are yet to come. Let me pray for you. Father, in my life, in our lives, when we feel fear, may it be replaced by confidence and courage. When we feel uncertainty, let it be replaced by hope. And when I feel risk, may I be excited about what is yet to come. When everything within us tells us to stay, let us hear your voice that whispers, go. And when everything outside tells us to leave, to abandon ship, and to run, let us hear your call to endure. My prayer is that we would not be a people who are shaped by good church or nice music or anything like that, but that we would be a community who are called out of darkness to spread light. That we would understand that if we are still here on this earth, it is because you have a purpose for us, and we are not done yet. And if we are not done yet, then you are not done yet. Let us see the world that way, the way you see it. And let us enter into the future courageously, with hope and courage and faith and strength and love, because that's who you are. And I pray this in the name of your Son, Jesus. Amen.